Politics without the soap opera, with unfiltered constitutional conservative truth. The Conservative Review with Daniel Horowitz.
And welcome back, fellow patriots, to the Conservative Review podcast. Yes, patriots, peace-loving taxpayers, you actually matter to someone, and this is your show. Because if you haven't committed a felony, if you're not an illegal alien, you should matter, even though you don't matter to many of the political elites. Now, I was just in Manhattan last night at a speaking engagement, so I trashed my voice talking when I already have a cold. So we're going to have a special guest today. Just to frame this issue, we're going to put up on the screen here, I want you guys to see in City Journal, this is a publication of the Manhattan Institute, Heather McDonald has an unbelievable article on the homeless situation in San Francisco. So I want you guys to read that article as you go through this show, because one of the things we've done the last several years is really tied together a number of elements. The growing crime wave in many parts of the country, particularly in California, sanctuaries, the border, gangs, drugs, how it all ties in. You know, the more sanctuaries you have, the weak on drug and weak on crime policies, you're going to have more drugs. But there's another dimension to this that we really haven't touched on a lot. I haven't really done any writing on it, and that's the homeless problem. Now, it's been around for a while. It's been around maybe 30, 40 years or so. But in some areas, particularly on the West Coast, it sure seems to be getting worse. According to San Francisco city data, it looks like they've had a 17% increase in homelessness over the last 2 years. What is behind this? Where is it coming from? Why does it seem to be getting worse, and what do we do about it? So with us today, we're going to bring on Heather McDonald. To you guys, I mean, most of you guys know who she is because she's one of the few people fighting for the rule of law and law enforcement. But for those of you who don't know, she is a Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's a contributing editor to City Journal, and she also wrote some important books. The one I read was The War on Cops. I actually have it right here, and I wish I would have had it in the background here, but maybe while Heather's talking, I'll go show it to you guys. And her most recent book is The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. She got her JD from Stanford University Law School. Most importantly, at a conference last year, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, a friend of mine, real friend of law enforcement, called Heather the greatest thinker on criminal justice in America today. Heather, it's really an honor to bring you in today. And my only regret is I don't know why I haven't had you on sooner after talking about this issue for 4 years.
Well, Daniel, Sessions made that remark. I was in the room. Had you been in the room, I think you would have understood the proper hierarchy of insight on criminal justice and as well as effectiveness. But this is a real honor, and I haven't been on because you've had lots of great guests, and so it's a pleasure to be on with you now.
Well, there aren't too many people. You could probably fit us all in a phone book. Those of us who still believe in broken windows policing and caring more about the victim of crime, law enforcement. But I wanted to jump straight into this homelessness problem. To be honest, I'm a little bit embarrassed. It's not even been on my radar until fairly recently, this issue. It's getting bad in some areas on the East Coast where we are, but it's not quite as bad as in the West Coast. I saw very recently, the California Chamber of Commerce put out a poll, and they said Californian voters are anxious. 79% of Californians agree that homelessness and criminal behavior have become rampant throughout California. 73% agree that street crime, shoplifting, and car theft have become rampant throughout California. And 60% say, I no longer feel safe because of the danger and disorder in society today. What's going on in the Golden State?
Maximal tolerance for dysfunctional antisocial behavior. You rightly connect, Daniel, the sanctuary city movement as well as homelessness. They are united at least on one point, which is the unwillingness of society's mainstream elites at this point to enforce basic norms of behavior, whether it's obedience to our immigration law and respect for the national sovereignty, or norms around public behavior in cities. So it used to be totally non-controversial 50, 60 years ago, much less 100 years ago, that nobody has a right to colonize city sidewalks, to defecate in public, to urinate in public, to use drugs, to toss needles in front of schoolyards, in front of people's homes. And the police responded appropriately to such behavior, which was to move people along. Now, driven, I think, overwhelmingly by the concept of disparate impact and how any kind of rule or law enforcement inevitably disparately impacts so-called underrepresented minorities in our culture, the elites have simply backed off of enforcement. Now, I think you have been a little bit asleep, Daniel, to be perfectly honest, because homelessness has been a huge problem since the 90s, and not just in California, but on the East Coast. But Mayor Giuliani, the great Rudolph Giuliani, who was the elected mayor in 1994 when New Yorkers got absolutely fed up with the street chaos and crime in New York City, that had a huge component of unorderly, disorderly, uncivil, homeless, vagrant behavior. They threw aside their self-righteous, progressive aspirations and elected, God forbid, a Republican who enforced the law. And it turns out that enforcement works. He made a big dent in the homeless problem and a big dent in the crime problem. That is not going on in California. And now when you have a set of laws that are part of something that you've been following closely, Daniel, and covering, which is decriminalization and de-incarceration, the police have no incentive to enforce norms around public behavior, and that acts as a magnet. People are drawn across the country to these West Coast cities, whether it's San Francisco or Los Angeles, because they know they can party with impunity.
Party with impunity. So that's a very interesting thing I learned from reading your article. So obviously, if you talk to the left, they will say, oh, it's too hard to find housing. These people have no fault of their own are out on the streets, so we need more programs. But what you targeted, and you mentioned this a little bit now, is, quote, the combination of maximal tolerance for antisocial behavior on the one hand and free services and food on the other acts as a magnet. So you say from your trip that you took down to San Francisco, did you dress up as a homeless person? You went undercover?
No, I just talked to people. I bought drugs completely as myself. The drug dealing on the part of the illegal Honduran drug dealers is so flagrant there. I wanted to test what is their threshold of suspicion, since I don't think like your average junkie, but I scored a very good deal, all cash transaction, and there was not a chance of enforcement. So I find generally with reporting, people are more than happy to talk. And, what you discover is it's driven, as I say, by the failure on the elite's part to enforce basic norms and simply say, this is not allowable, period. I mean, that's how you stop it. You stop it very easily. You say, you can't do this. But the supply side is this country's unbelievable drug addiction problem. There is something going wrong with American culture, and has been so for decades, that so many people are involved in drugs, that you combine that with mental illness, which is also very prevalent among the street vagrant population, and you get a very elevated risk of violence. The mentally ill, the received wisdom is that generally they do not have higher rates of violence. But when you couple mental illness with substance drugs, abuse, the violence goes up exponentially. So we are putting law-abiding citizens' safety at risk by tolerating a behavior that simply has no place on city streets.
Oh, man, I saw an article recently actually speaking to that in Sacramento at the Capitol grounds. The gardeners who are taking care of the Capitol grounds, they were being assaulted by the homeless. And I mean, I know that's certainly an issue where I am in Baltimore, Maryland, where the cops always say they're confronted with big problems with the general criminal population, whether they're homeless or not. because they're all on drugs now.
Right.
And the little common sense they might have had and the little sense of deterrent or of them being deterred by the cops, let's say, drawing their weapons is out the window. So they're caught in a catch-22 where often they have to shoot someone, but they don't want to. So therefore they just step back and don't get involved. What I wanted to go through here is, a common theme of this. It's a long article, but it's worth you guys really reading every sentence of it because it's firsthand reporting. It really is. It mixes policy analysis with firsthand reporting. And this is the stuff that policymakers should be using. But unfortunately, it's, we don't have too many friends. Yes, what I find very frustrating is when it comes to drugs, crime, and homelessness, there's nothing novel about any of that. That's always been around. So it's very subtle when there's changes, but clearly, and it's hard to put an exact date on it, but a benchmark year for many of us was 2014. If you look at any chart of the drug crisis, it's like 2014, 2015, it went bonkers. And to me, it's unmistakable that the last couple of years, wherever you want to put a timeline on it, you had Prop 47 in California, you had the Trust Act, which is the sanctuary law, all converging within a few years. When you have more illegal immigrants and then therefore more illegal alien, criminal alien distribution networks at the primary trafficking level, which, by the way, DEA tells me in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in the Southeast in Atlanta, they have told me that at a primary level, if they were allowed to just get rid of every illegal alien doing drug dealing, it would make the availability much more scarce and the prices would go up. So when you have more of that, more sanctuaries, and then hold that thought, coupling it with putting immigration aside, just the general drugs are awesome, how dare you lock people up for that, and a lot of legislation actually codifying that sentiment, to me, it's not a surprise that we're going to take the drug crisis to the next level. And isn't it true, Heather, that once you have so many more people roped into that, you're going to have more homelessness?
Absolutely right. It scares the heck out of me that we have this discourse now around normalizing drug use. And frankly, it verges on celebrating it. I have a libertarian friend, very well funded, she's has many resources and is very committed to marijuana legalization. That's an empirical question, whether it will reduce violence, as the libertarians claim, or increase it. But one thing that is absolutely missing from this legalization rhetoric is any public validation of temperance and sobriety. There is nothing pushing back against the idea that drug use is without consequences, and it is something that we should just celebrate. So that's spreading. You're absolutely right. And of course, the whole normalization of illegal entry, which is a race to the bottom on the part of the Democratic candidates, does make this whole thing much worse. It is simply astounding to me, and I know you've addressed this, Daniel, that police chiefs are so beholden to their liberal mayors, to their own sense of self-righteous virtue signaling legitimacy, that they are not availing themselves of this extraordinarily efficient and powerful tool to clean up their streets of petty criminals by calling in the feds and saying, of course, we're going to cooperate with you in detaining somebody who's been put in jail. We will honor your detainer. And these police chiefs that are thumbing their nose, whether it's Chief Johnson in Chicago, who refuses to attend Trump's speech because of Chicago's sanctuary policies, or LA Chief Michael, I can't remember his name right now, Michelle Moore, who takes every opportunity to denounce any hint of immigration enforcement. They are betraying the public trust. And the question remains, when is the public going to finally say enough is enough? It happened in New York in 1994 with the election of Rudolph Giuliani. California obviously has a double whammy of a very progressive elite, as well as a growing population of Hispanics that make sanity all the more difficult. But you can see the huge rumblings of discontent in places like San Francisco. There's been some techie, tech bros who have gone on Twitter and Facebook to express their utter despair and contempt for the condition of the streets in extraordinarily vivid and unapologetic terms. They've been basically drummed out of town. So you still have the tyranny of the progressive left ideology, but I think there may come a point of a tipping point when people finally say enough is enough. We have to start enforcing drug laws again. We have to increase the ability of the authorities to commit somebody for mental illness against their will. And we're simply going to empower the police to move people along when they are taking over city streets and defecating in public, throwing litter, spewing trash all over, putting people at risk.
So that's a very interesting point with the low-level crime, so to speak. We've chronicled on this show that I'm right now working on a piece on the highest of highest levels. I mean, I'm talking about someone arrested on 18 counts of child molesting, a guy who had rape charges from 8 different women, let out on $5,000 bond, and then rapes a 9th woman. I mean, there's jailbreak for the worst of the worst people, and that's obvious. But what you're talking about is the forgotten utility of what we all used to call broken windows policing, which was so vividly effective during the Giuliani era, which is when you start tolerating petty theft, obviously the antisocial behavior, the camping out on the city streets and the littering, well, then you get more of it. And if you get more of it, well, what do you have? You have the homeless, you have the drugs, and you get violent people. And then there's the violent crime. But I want to touch on the theft a little bit, because you mentioned the techies, and they're obviously going to be all very liberal. Yeah. But what I don't understand is this: at some point, don't their chickens come home to roost? I'm seeing a lot of data on theft and larceny increasing, petty theft increasing. I actually saw, and Heather, money talks. You could argue over crime statistics all you want, but money is the best indicator. San Francisco off-duty cops are logging in more hours than ever because the businesses are hiring them because they could actually carry guns. Well, why the sudden rush to hire them? Because of the theft problem, no? I mean, isn't this Prop 47?
Absolutely. Car theft is huge. It's leveled off a little bit recently in the last year or so in California, but that's after setting absolutely record highs. You hear stories about shoplifters going around with a calculator to make sure that they're shoplifting under the $950 limit that will keep them as a misdemeanor rather than a felony theft. And yeah, it's just now viewed as a cost of doing business. You can talk to Starbucks baristas who, every other day at the minimum in their places, the homeless come in and rip stuff off. They're all told, don't do anything about it. That may be the wise course on the part of managers because the risk of violence is always there. Nevertheless, obviously, if this just becomes a normal behavior, you do get more of it. The left simply cannot understand the relationship between a failure to set norms against antisocial behavior and the invitation to engage in more of that, just as they can't understand the relationship between enforcement and a society that by and large obeys the rule of law. It used to be the received wisdom in the highest policing circles that the police could do nothing about crime. The FBI used to publish an annual disclaimer along with its Uniform Crime Report national crime study every year, saying, well, of course, we all know that the police can't do anything about homicide. That's a social problem. To solve it, you need to remove racial inequalities and economic inequalities. There was this remarkable admission of poverty, of inability, of inefficacy. But nevertheless, you had this police chief saying we can't fight crime, we cannot lower it. That all changed in New York in the 90s when it turns out that policing works. Policing works. You enforce the law, people's behavior changes. When you don't enforce the law, you're going to get lawlessness. It's a very simple equation.
But in this article, you take it to the next level. So you say it's not just that they're not enforcing the laws. That's for sure. I mean, they're not enforcing, theft across the board and drug laws, even, outside the context of homelessness. But one of the themes you hone in on is that everyone always talks about, the high cost of living, the high cost of housing in a place like San Francisco, as if that these people are somehow pretty much normal. They just can't afford it and they wind up on the streets. There's another statistic in there that shocked me. You said that the city has distributed 4.5 million syringes. What is that? Could you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive enabling industry. The city, an ex-police officer, police chief in San Francisco sent me a pamphlet that the city's health department hands out on how to inject drugs allegedly safely, but really the most effectively. It is absolutely gruesome and hair-raising. Photos of how to find your vein, how to cook it, how to mix it with bleach, lemon, to make it inject better. It is utterly terrifying. There are syringe disposal boxes posted throughout the city outside of the public toilets to try and encourage these users to put their syringes so-called safely in these storage boxes rather than throwing them on the streets. Of course, most of them are still thrown on the streets, flush down toilets, end up in gutters, in the city's sewage. Again, you have now this parasitic industry, mostly government funded, sometimes privately funded. Not only do they hand out the paraphernalia of drug use, they also, of course, hand out blankets, free food. You can't, the carelessness with which the homeless treat food, of leaving whole unopened bags of nuts, of cookies, of pastries that have been donated to them, unopened on the street, tossing things in the gutter, is unbelievable. And yet the advocates from the 80s on forward have crafted and perfected a narrative that says this is a housing problem. It's the failure of capitalism to be able to provide housing to the needy, and it has nothing to do with behavior. Now, that was false back then. It's false now. There's no city that provides more affordable housing than San Francisco. But what I challenge in this article is the idea first that nobody's ever justified or explained why any given city is morally obligated to provide housing to somebody who shows up on its streets and claims homelessness. Why are taxpayers suddenly on the hook for that?
Your money or your life. It's like, hey, I'll shoot you if you don't give me money. Since when was that part of the social compact?
It's incredible. I mean, San Francisco spends almost $50,000 a year. That's counting the most minimal expenses. That's counting on the homeless, per homeless. Every homeless person has about $50,000. That's only counting the official homeless expenditures. It leaves out welfare. It leaves out criminal justice. It leaves out health. Many a San Francisco taxpayer would be very happy to have $50,000 of services spent on him. But let's say somehow that just because you've brought in people from Iowa, addicts who have heard that this is a really good place to party where you won't be thrown in jail, they show up and all of a sudden the taxpayers of San Francisco become obligated to provide you with housing. Then you have no entitlement for housing in San Francisco.
Wait, Heather, slow it down there. Wait a minute. You said something very important there. You're indicating that it's not just people in the area. You're saying people are coming from all over to join in this camping out in San Francisco?
Oh, sure. The word is out. I mean, I wrote a big article on Skid Row of Los Angeles, which I have to say, is the nadir. I mean, there is nothing like Skid Row. As bad as San Francisco is, Skid Row is something out of a Bosch nightmare. And I talked to people there, and they said, yeah, the people come from the Midwest because they've heard that this is such a good party scene. So, of course, there's a network. Just as the criminals know every last subsection and caveat of criminal law. When Prop 47 passed, I talked to some homeless people in Santa Ana Civic Center Plaza in California, and they knew the ins and outs of 47 to a letter. But they also know what the climate is for tolerance, and they do come. But in any case, what I advocate is make the provision of housing a regional responsibility, because the homeless problem is regional. People are fluid, and build shelters, build clean and sober living facilities outside of cities in abandoned, cheap industrial land. Taxpayers deserve to get the most bang for their buck. And I'm also do something in this article that is really breaking taboos and justify NIMBYism. This is not in my backyard when people protest having a homeless shelter built in their neighborhood. And the conventional line on that is, oh, these callous, uncompassionate people, how brutal of you and how unthinking of you and petty of you to be not in my backyard. No, not in my backyard is a perfectly legitimate response.
Yep.
And
what liberals always try to do is they always look at the 0.001, but when you're dealing with public policy, you have to drive down the middle, and you have to look at most people aren't mentally ill, most people aren't criminals, and you got to protect them. That's part of the social compact. So what you're saying is you're thinking of affirmative ways of doing it, but there's first the negative, that you have to make it clear there is no camping out. So could you speak a little bit about this very important court case in Boise, Idaho? What starts in California is increasingly migrating to Idaho. I hear it from a lot of people there, and they're like, we're not doing this. So in Idaho, they went ahead and they passed an anti-camping ordinance, and the Ninth Circuit and I guess the Idaho district judge, which is that district court is also problematic, said there's somehow an Eighth Amendment right to camp out on the streets.
Well, actually, the district court upheld the city of Boise. Okay. It was the Ninth Circuit Appellate Court that reversed. Mm-hmm. And this is actually reinstating a previous Ninth Circuit ruling that came out of Los Angeles that had the same conclusion, that a very specious line of precedent from the 1960s about whether you can criminalize so-called involuntary behavior violates the Eighth Amendment. The Ninth Circuit reached the ruling in LA that was a violation. Enforcing anti-camping ordinances violated the Eighth Amendment. That was settled, so that didn't become precedent. This recent Ninth Circuit decision sort of exhumes the reasoning of this earlier case called Jones. This latter case, Martin v. Boise, states again something. First of all, Daniel, let's notice the Eighth Amendment is only about punishment. It only says that the state, once it decides what behavior is criminal, cannot impose cruel and unusual punishments like quartering, like torture, things that were still in use, in practice in the 18th century. It does not restrict what a duly elected legislature can decide to say is behavior that is out of bounds. This line of precedent that ended, has its most recent fruition with this case out of Idaho, says that the Eighth Amendment, which only talks about whether you can impose, hanging by electric shock after torture on somebody who has shot his neighbor, actually restricts how a government can decide to govern public space. And so they've ruled that unless a city is confident that at any given moment in time, if every single vagrant came off the streets miraculously and said, we want housing, which never happens and will never happen, you cannot get them off the streets. You can offer services and housing all you want, and most people turn it down. But let's say something miraculous happened, everybody came in. If there wasn't a shelter bed for every single person living on the streets, then everybody gets a free pass and everybody gets to camp out. And that is a restrictive ruling that is made it even harder for cities. Now, some have been already doing that. You know, I don't want to give these liberal governments too much of a free pass and allow them to say, oh, it's only this recent Ninth Circuit Court opinion. Otherwise, we would be so careful about vindicating the rights of the law-abiding, hardworking residents of our city, but the bad Ninth Circuit make us do this. They were already pretty liberal.
Oh, yeah.
But this makes it even harder. And this case will be appealed to the Supreme Court. Theodore Olson, who was he's a big Republican lawyer at the law firm of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher in LA. Now he's got, he flips back and forth. He's very bad on immigration. He's recently.
Oh my gosh.
He's recently
some other issues as well. I mean,
right.
But no, this is an important case. And look, Heather, I mean, nothing's like that same Ninth Circuit saying it's a violation of the Eighth Amendment not to castrate someone in Idaho prisons. I mean, I'm not kidding you. Someone who says, I want to be castrated, right. Idaho must pay for it. I mean, ironically, some of us joke around doing it to child molesters. They would say that violates the Eighth Amendment if you did it, but then if you ask for it and we don't want to do it anyway, I mean, they're crazy. And as Clarence Thomas says all the time, it's part of a broader problem on every clause of the Constitution that they flip in unalienable negative rights and conflate them with positive affirmative desires and privileges. So what's up is down, what's down is up. I know you got to go soon. I want to just, I'd be remiss if I didn't have you, if I had you on the show and I didn't get a little bit just into the general crime issues. There is an onslaught. I have never seen anything like this in my career, and I cover a lot of different issues where there is a one-sided fight at the elite level. Whether it's the politicians, every single Republican I know of in Washington, except for a few, whether it's at a media level where Fox News, for the first time in their entire history, put out a press release endorsing a piece of legislation. They endorsed the First Step Act. There is this maniacal, frenetic desire to lower the prison population at all costs. One of the things they're doing in your state, effective January 1st, I want to get your take on this. So they're essentially abolishing cash bail for a good chunk of crimes. And then at the same time, they're forcing disclosure that the prosecutor give over to the defendant all of the information about witnesses, their statements, including grand jury statements, while they're out. So the two provisions brilliantly work together. I was just looking at a case in Alaska where, again, this guy who was arrested for the 9th rape while he was out on bail, the whole issue was the women were scared to testify, and he was out. We had Sandra Dorley, the Monroe County prosecutor from Rochester, on, and I didn't know this, but I asked her, what are some of the biggest impediments to landing a conviction? Why is it that they always plead down and you always seem to have to accept it? And she said, it's witnesses. We can't get them because they're scared. I didn't realize how much of a problem it is. What do you think of this New York law? Is it designed to ensure that there's more of this pleading down?
Well, first of all, the witness non-cooperation is in part the fear of cooperation, but it's also the no snitch ethic among these gangbangers that hate the police so much that they simply refuse to cooperate because I don't know how scared they really are. They're going around carrying drugs and shooting each other, carrying guns rather than shooting each other up. So it's two things, but certainly the witness intimidation is a big one. I just think that the issue that I brought up at the beginning of our conversation, Daniel, which is the disparate impact, the fact that virtually any law or norm that is enforced is going to fall disproportionately on Blacks, to the greatest extent, to a certain lesser extent on Hispanics, because of family breakdown and because of enormously higher rates of criminality across the board, whether it's low-level crimes or high-level crimes. I mean, we're talking about a homicide rate that is about 10 to 1 Blacks to whites. That is astounding, and the public has been kept completely in the dark about that. And so that disparate impact analysis, which says that any type of enforcement that results in the disproportionate representation of Blacks in prison, a disproportion that is driven exclusively by crime rates, that's something the left will not accept, that any enforcement must be rolled back. And
well, you say the left, Heather, but where I sit, it's awfully lonely.
Right. Well, please, you left President Trump out of that. I mean, he is so opportunistic, so without principles, that he has completely jumped on the left's bandwagon and claiming that rational sentencing policies are racist. It's appalling. You know, we learned in the Obama era and when we had a president who invited Black Lives Matter activists into the White House, who took every opportunity to further this false narrative that the criminal justice system is systemically racist and only racism explains the overrepresentation of Blacks in prison. We learned that rhetoric matters, and Trump hasn't been as bad for sure, and Sessions was fabulous. Nevertheless, for him to start demagoguing against Joe Biden for having signed the 1994 federal crime control bill is really appalling.
I couldn't believe it. At one of the debates, the RNC puts out a press release. I don't know if you saw that. I did an article on it, hitting Kamala Harris from the left. Like, yeah, you know, you actually enforced the law back in the day. I mean, since when did this happen? And yeah, we've hit the president on this because the president used to say what you and I are saying. We actually have the tweets where he said it. He said, look, they commit an overwhelming amount of crime. People don't want to talk about it. But what I've seen from the data, and I know you've done extensive research on this, it's in your book, it's in a lot of your City Journal articles we're going to try to link to in our show notes. But what I've seen, and we'll link to this article, How Can Incarceration Rates Be Racist If They Reflect Actual Crime Rates? What the prison population seems to suggest, from what I've seen, is that if anything, there might be an under-incarceration problem, particularly among Blacks, because they like to blame it on drug laws. But if you look at the uniform crime reporting, while they do commit drug crimes at a higher level than their share of the pie, it's 12, 13% of the population, it's nowhere near the share of robberies, murder, and assaults. So what I found is that if you would take out every single drug trafficker from prison, their share of the composition of the prison population would not go down, because isn't it largely the big four crimes that are driving it?
Yeah, absolutely. The Black prison population, when you take federal and state prisons into account, is about 37.6%. You take out all drug prisoners from all federal and state prisons, and the Black population goes down from like 37.6 to 37.4%. So in other words, this narrative that the disproportion is all driven by drug enforcement is completely false. And yes, about over 50% of all prisoners are there for violent crime. Over another quarter is due to property crime. The drug crimes that are there are overwhelmingly for trafficking. Nobody, zero, -0, are in any sort of prison or jail for smoking a joint. It does not happen. And yet that is the major excuse. And, you know, we talked briefly about broken windows enforcement, and I would include enforcement of, say, public drug use. The people who are begging for that type of enforcement are law-abiding Blacks and Hispanics who see what it is like to live in a disorderly environment. They are terrified of those groups of rowdy youth that are hanging out on street corners fighting, because they know that out of that street disorder comes violence. There was a girl in Chicago, 12-year-old girl, who was shot to death by a 19-year-old marijuana dealer. Again, we're supposed to believe that marijuana is such a pacific enterprise, whether it's dealing or using. He was shooting at rivals, wildly shooting across the street, and killed this young girl, Takia Holmes. The people that live with the open-air drug trade understand this, and they want that type of enforcement.
No, absolutely. I've seen it here in Baltimore, too, where we've had crime waves and we have these, neighborhood meetings and town halls, and there's a number of Black individuals who show up. They're a little bit older, usually, gray hair, and they're very concerned about that. And those are the people that are obviously hurt the most. I mean, I see it every day here. It's not in my neighborhood where you're going to see the dead bodies. Now, we do have the car break-ins and all these problems since Freddie Gray, but the body count in Baltimore is almost every single person is Black. And speaking of Baltimore, I'll let you go after this. I know your time is short, but I got to discuss the war on cops. So I want our listeners to take a look at this video here from the Baltimore Fraternal Order of Police they put out on Twitter.
Don't talk to popo, that's a no-no, you will get shot now. You got that free throw, that's a free throw, and that bitch a bust down. Don't let talk out, don't fight out, you know I got that. Don't let talk out of the bag now, that's better, man. You put my leg right in the down now, that's not bad now. I'm getting out for it, I'm fair now, this is going down now. I'm back, always right. I got the stick in my 40, I just got the ball, I got the big. Boy, now you're with that, you had shit now. She ain't no hold that her best friend. I live shit now. Yeah, bitch. My nigga trapped in the building. Nigga lose that gang shit, bitch. Sticks out.
Is it my imagination, or does it seem that the war on cops has gotten worse since you wrote that book 3 years ago?
Well, it's been bad for a long time. I talked to a Black federal marshal who was trying to arrest a fugitive felon in the North Bronx, and he got out of his car and was immediately surrounded by about 24 people cursing at him. Somebody picked up a pike, threatened to kill him. He only got out by calling for backup. So since the Black Lives Matter movement, things have gotten worse since the Michael Brown shooting. But frankly, in New York, we have the practice of airmail, which is trash, bags of urine, feces, sanitary napkins thrown off of cops from the roofs of housing projects. That's been going on since the 1960s and 70s. I can't say whether things are getting worse, but things are very bad.
I say that, Heather, because the number of suicides among cops has doubled this year over recent years. So I was just wondering if some of this is playing a role. I just saw, and I forget, I'm really not doing justice because I had trouble pronouncing his name even when I remembered it. It starts with an L. The cop who last Friday was hit over the head with a metal chair from someone who came behind him. He was put in a medically induced coma. He thankfully came out of the hospital. And unbelievably, while he was hit over the head with something that swelled up his brain, he managed to draw his weapon and kill the guy, which I just thought was amazing. How a guy could do that. He almost died from it. But yet, I look at the media and some of the quotes from the state legislators of that area, and they think it's an unjustifiable shooting. I mean, to me, that goes hand in hand with what I'm wondering is the increased, suicidal tendencies among some of them, that they're getting placed in very tough situations.
It's odd because, the Black Lives Matter narrative has been somewhat displaced from national attention, which is now focused exclusively on getting Trump out of office. So the sort of constant drumbeat, the saying the cops are racist, has gone down in the media since the Obama years. And yet it seems like we have set this poison in motion, and it is spreading without the same level of gasoline being poured on it by, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but a fire that's burning. Sure. From the national media. It's going on now sort of at the local level, from the prosecutors that are decriminalizing, that are claiming constantly that the criminal justice system is racist. And yes, we are, you denigrate law enforcement, you delegitimate it, and you are absolutely putting something that Americans are far too sanguine about, which is the rule of law, at risk. You know, the normal human condition is tribalism. It is hatred. It is violence. It is corruption. It is the effort to destroy anybody seen as the other. And we have managed to tame that beast pretty well over our history. But between the demonization of cops, the absolute blank slate that Antifa gets, we really are playing with fire. And, you know, it could get worse. Maybe it will not, but it could take us into a situation that Americans are utterly ignorant and naive about.
And that's the thing. I don't want to wait until it gets back to the 80s. I want to start throwing the red flag now, especially when it's not like they're stopping. I mean, they're just getting started. And you're right. You know, Trump screwed us on one issue. On the remaining part of this portfolio, I mean, Barr has given some good speeches. Certainly the DOJ is not going to be pressing on cops under this administration, but every cop who serves in a major police organization, by definition, they're going to be in big blue areas. Those are the toughest areas. And the politics of all of those cities have become so extreme that whether it's the judges, even now some of the prosecutors elected by Soros, and then certainly the politicians and the media, my concern is that it's getting even worse over time. And then to add to that, some of our colleagues and donors of some of these organizations, at a time where we need to back the blue more than ever, they're saying, oh no, we're arresting too many people, as if it's still 1998. They've learned nothing. They haven't watched the trajectory of the last 5, 8, 10 years, even in some places. Any parting thoughts before we let you go?
Well, I would just add police chiefs to that. Police chiefs are cowards. And again, it is the politics. It's the left-wingery. It's the demographic transformation that's going on. They are complicitous in the public's ignorance about why police officers are in certain neighborhoods. I gave a talk in a southern city to a bunch of people in law enforcement, prosecutors, local DAs, federal prosecutors, and the city's police chief. I'm not going to name him. He's gone on to another very big position. And I was telling the statistics about Black crime. And afterwards he said to me, yeah, I know those statistics. Well, why doesn't he talk about them? You know, he's now gone on to a very highly pressed position in a city that is absolutely racked with homicides. And the police chiefs are willing to let their cops twist in the wind of public hatred, take a completely specious charge of racism for simply going to try to protect people where the crime is highest, because the police chiefs will not educate the public about how bad things are in inner cities. And that does create stress. We are asking the police in our country to live with knowledge of a reality of the savagery that can happen in these inner city areas without fathers, that the public turns its eyes away from. And to bear that knowledge and not be able to talk about it is extraordinarily stressful. And I think that is also contributing to the suicides that we're seeing.
Yep. And there you have it. I mean, we've had on a typical year, 8,000 Black homicide victims, and something like in a given year, 15, 16, 17 Blacks killed by police. And that's not even accounting for whether they were justified or not. And nobody I mean, I'm sure you have the numbers, but it's something like 0.001%. and there's no focus on this. I mean, Heather, I thank you so much for your very generous time, almost 45 minutes here, but it was needed. I feel alone. I feel alone in this battle. I lost a 4-year battle at the federal level, and that's, as we say, the first step. There are many more steps to dismantling criminal justice, and I know you're going to be there with us to help fight this. Until next time, thank you guys for listening. Send me your questions for Heather. I could ask her offline. Subscribe to our YouTube page. Till tomorrow, God bless you all.